The silver chains bit into my wrists as I knelt before the altar, my own blood pooling beneath me in patterns that made the high priest recoil in horror. Above us, the sky had turned the color of old blood, and the very air seemed to scream as something ancient and terrible tore through the veil between worlds. "It's her!" my sister Leanna shrieked, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "The curse in her blood, it's calling to him. She's brought the Demon King here." The assembled villagers pressed back against the temple walls, their faces twisted with fear and disgust as they stared at the crimson symbols my blood had etched into the sacred stone. Even chained and weakened, even after 16 years of hiding what I was, my cursed blood sang with power at the Demon King's arrival. My mother, Lady Alara Blackthorn, stepped forward with cold eyes that had never held love for me. "I should have drowned you the day you were born," she hissed. "When your blood first turned black in the birthing chamber, I knew you were an abomination." The ground shook as something massive landed on the temple roof. Tiles crashed down around us, and through the holes torn in the ceiling, I glimpsed scaled hide that seemed to absorb light itself. The Demon King had come to our realm at last, just as the prophecies had foretold, and everyone believed it was my fault. "Please," I whispered, tasting copper as blood ran from my split lip. "I never meant for this to happen. I've tried to hide what I am, tried to be normal." "Normal?" My father, Lord Marcus Blackthorn, laughed bitterly. "Look what your abomination has wrought, Kira. The moment you were born, Seer spoke of the darkness you would bring. We should have listened." Another impact shook the temple. The Demon King's roar split the air, a sound like reality itself being torn apart. I felt my cursed blood respond, growing hot in my veins, the black pattern spreading up my arms like living ink. "Cast her out!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Give her to the demon. Maybe it will spare us." "Yes," my mother said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Bind her to the sacred oak. Let her cursed blood call to its master. Perhaps when he claims what's his, he'll leave our lands in peace." I looked up at them through the black tears that streamed from my eyes whenever my curse stirred. At my family, at the villagers I'd grown up among, at the priest who'd blessed me as a baby before he knew what I was. Not one face showed mercy, not one voice spoke in my defense. They had always feared me, but now that fear had crystallized into hatred, into betrayal, into a willingness to sacrifice me to save themselves. As they dragged me from the temple, my blood leaving a trail of dark sigils on the floor, I felt something shift deep within me. The curse I'd spent 16 years trying to suppress suddenly felt less like a burden and more like a gift. My blood pulsed with ancient power, and for the first time in my life, I stopped fighting it. They wanted to give me to the Demon King. Perhaps it was time they learned exactly what my cursed blood could do. The memory of that night, the night everything changed, came back to me in fragments as I hung from the sacred oak. Iron chains cutting deep enough that my black blood dripped steadily onto the earth below. Each drop hissed and smoked where it landed, and I could feel something stirring in response to my pain. But this wasn't the first time they'd hurt me. It wasn't even the first time they'd chained me like an animal. I was 3 when my blood first turned black. I remember the exact moment. I'd fallen from the garden wall while playing with Leanna, scraping my knee on the stones. When I looked down at the wound, expecting normal red blood, I saw something that looked like liquid midnight seeping from the cut. It moved wrong, too viscous, too alive. It formed symbols on my skin before disappearing entirely, as if it had never existed at all. Leanna saw it too. She started screaming. Mother found us in the garden, Leanna sobbing hysterically while I sat confused and bleeding. When she saw the black stain on the stones where my blood had fallen, her face went white as parchment. "Get the priest," she whispered to a servant, "and the mage, now." They tested me for months, pricked my fingers, drew vials of the dark substance that flowed through my veins, consulted ancient texts, and spoke in hushed tones about curses and bloodline corruption. The mage, an ancient woman named Morgwyn, finally gave them their answer. "The child carries the blood of binding," she said, her voice heavy with implications. "It's a curse older than memory, tied to the deepest magic of this realm. Those who bear it are marked by powers beyond the veil." "Can it be cured?" my father demanded. "It cannot be removed," Morgwyn replied. "It can only be contained." That was when the real horror began. They moved me to the tower room. the one farthest from the family quarters. Iron bars on the windows, salt circles on the floor, protective wards carved into every surface. They told the staff I was ill, that I needed isolation for my own protection. But I knew the truth. They were protecting themselves from me. Leanna, who had once shared my dolls and my secrets, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. She'd cross herself whenever she saw me, muttering prayers under her breath. Within a year, she'd convinced herself that I'd tried to poison her with my touch, that my presence made her nightmares worse. "She's evil," I heard her tell our governess one day. "I can feel it crawling under her skin. Sometimes her eyes go completely black." Mother grew cold and distant, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary. Meals were left outside my door. My lessons continued, but with tutors who hurried through their sessions and left as quickly as possible. Father avoided me entirely, as if I was a shameful secret he couldn't bear to acknowledge. The worst part wasn't the isolation, it was the constant fear in their eyes. Even as a child, I could see how my own family flinched when I walked into a room, how conversations stopped when I appeared, how they spoke about me in whispers, as if saying my name too loudly might summon something terrible. When I was 8, a traveling merchant noticed my black blood during a minor accident in the courtyard. Word spread through the village like wildfire. Suddenly, every failed crop, every stillborn calf, every minor misfortune was blamed on the cursed child living in Blackthorn Manor. "She's a herald," the village priest declared from his pulpit. "The prophecies speak of one whose blood runs black, who will herald the coming of darkness to our realm." They started leaving iron horseshoes on our doorstep, painting protective symbols on their houses. Mothers pulled their children close when I passed, as if I might corrupt them with a glance. My family's response was swift and brutal. They hired a private tutor so I'd never have to leave the manor grounds, built higher walls around our estate, and most crushing of all, they forbade me from attending any family gatherings or social events. "It's for everyone's safety," my mother explained with the tone she might use to discuss weather. "People fear what they don't understand, Kira. Your presence makes them uncomfortable." Uncomfortable, as if my very existence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The years passed in a blur of loneliness and suppressed power. I felt my curse growing stronger as I aged, the blood in my veins sometimes feeling more like liquid fire than anything human. During my monthlies, my blood was so dark it looked like spilled ink, and it would form strange patterns on the cloth, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I learned to hide everything, to speak quietly, move carefully, never show emotion that might trigger the darkness I carried. I became an expert at being invisible in my own home, at pretending I didn't hear the servants whisper about the cursed daughter, or notice how Leanna's friends would cross themselves when they glimpsed me in a hallway. But hiding didn't make it easier. Every day was a reminder that I was wrong, broken, unwanted, that my own blood was something to be feared and contained. When Leanna turned 16, she had a grand coming out ball. Lords and ladies from across the kingdom came to celebrate her entrance into society. I watched from my tower window as carriages arrived, as music and laughter filled the air, as my sister danced in a gown that cost more than most families earned in a year. I wasn't invited to my own sister's ball. "It wouldn't be appropriate," my mother said when I asked. "You understand, don't you? Your condition. It makes people uncomfortable." That night, alone in my tower while the celebration raged below, I cut my palm with a dinner knife just to watch the black blood flow. It formed symbols on the windowsill, complex patterns that seemed to tell a story I couldn't read. For the first time in years, I didn't clean it up. I left it there as a reminder of what I was, of what they'd made me become. The next morning, Mother found the blood signs and had the entire tower room scrubbed with salt water and blessed by 3 different priests. She doubled my isolation after that, posting guards to ensure I never left the tower unsupervised. "We love you," she said during one of her rare visits. "But you have to understand, you're dangerous, Kira. If word got out about what you really are, it wouldn't just destroy you, it would destroy our entire family." Love. She called it love while keeping me prisoner in my own home, while treating me like a disease that might spread if not properly contained. The final betrayal came on my 16th birthday. Instead of a celebration, Instead of the debutante ball that was my birthright, they announced my betrothal to Lord Aldrich Thorne, a man 30 years my senior who lived in a remote mountain, keep hundreds of miles from civilization. He knows about your condition, Father explained, as if he was doing me a favor. He's agreed to the marriage in exchange for a substantial dowry. You'll be well cared for, and far enough away that your nature won't be a concern for anyone. They were selling me, shipping me off to rot in a mountain prison where my curse wouldn't embarrass them anymore. What if I refuse? I asked quietly. Father's expression hardened. Then you'll be declared dead to this family and cast out with nothing but the clothes on your back. At least with Lord Thorne, you'll have food and shelter. That was when I truly understood that I was nothing to them. Not a daughter, not even a person. I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be passed off to someone else. The 16 years of isolation, of suppression, of pretending my curse didn't exist, it had all been leading to this moment, to being discarded entirely. I should have left then, should have run away in the night and made my own fate somewhere far from their judgment. But I was still naive enough to hope things might change. Still foolish enough to believe that, somewhere deep down, my family loved me despite what I was. 3 days before my wedding, the sky turned red and the Demon King tore through the veil between worlds. And suddenly, everyone remembered exactly who to blame for the darkness that had come to our realm. The chains cut deeper as I struggled against them, my cursed blood painting dark symbols on the oak's ancient bark. Above me, the Demon King perched on the temple's shattered roof like some nightmare given form. He was larger than the legends claimed, easily 50 feet from snout to tail, with scales that seemed to absorb light and eyes like burning coals. When he spread his wings, they blotted out what remained of the sun. But he wasn't attacking yet. He was watching me. Look how it calls to him, someone whispered from the crowd that had gathered at a safe distance. The curse recognizes its master. I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that I'd never wanted this, never asked to be born with darkness in my veins. But as I hung there bleeding, feeling my curse respond to the Demon King's presence, something else began to stir in my mind. A memory that wasn't quite my own, child of shadow, daughter of binding. A voice whispered in my thoughts. Ancient, feminine, impossibly old. They fear what they do not understand. Who are you? I whispered, though I wasn't sure I'd spoken aloud. I am what you were before the curse became a cage, the voice replied. I am why your blood runs black, why your power frightens them so. Listen well, little shadow. The time for hiding is over. Suddenly, images flooded my mind. Not memories, but knowledge. Ancient knowledge that made my curse make sense for the first time in my life. The blood of binding wasn't a curse at all, it was a gift. Thousands of years ago, when the first Demon King had threatened to consume our realm, a group of mages had made the ultimate sacrifice. They bound their own life force, their very souls, into a bloodline that could channel the deepest magics. They created warriors whose blood could cut through demonic defenses, whose power grew stronger in the presence of otherworldly threats. The blood of binding wasn't corruption, it was salvation. But over the centuries, as demons retreated to their own realm and the immediate threat faded, people forgot the truth. The bloodline became rare. Those born with it were seen as harbingers rather than protectors. Fear replaced understanding. Heroes became monsters in the eyes of those who no longer remembered why they'd been created. Your ancestors died to give you this power, the voice continued, not to herald darkness, but to stand against it. The prophecies they whisper about speak not of your service to demons, but of your power over them. I felt my curse surge in response to this revelation, my black blood growing hot in my veins. The symbols it painted on the oak began to glow with silver light, and for the first time in my life, the darkness in me felt like armor rather than a burden. The Demon King roared, and this time I heard something different in the sound. Not triumph, but concern? That's impossible, I breathed. Is it? The voice asked. You've spent 16 years suppressing what you are, child. Imagine what you could do if you stopped fighting it. I looked down at the crowd, at my family huddled together, at the villagers who'd demanded my blood as payment for their safety, at the priest who'd proclaimed me an abomination. They'd cast me out, chained me like a sacrifice, condemned me as evil. But what if they were wrong? What if everything I'd been told about my curse was a lie? The Demon King descended from the temple roof, landing with an impact that shook the ground. He stalked closer to the oak, his burning eyes fixed on me, but he moved cautiously, almost warily. Please, Leanna called out to him, her voice shaking with terror. Take her! Take the cursed one and leave us be! The Demon King's massive head swiveled toward my sister, and he made a sound that might have been laughter. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding stone, like the death screams of mountains. Cursed, he rumbled, the word dripping with amusement. You call her cursed? You know nothing, little humans, nothing at all. His gaze returned to me, and I saw something in those burning eyes that chilled me to the bone. Recognition. And hunger. Hello, little binder, he purred. I've been waiting so very long to meet you. That was when I understood the truth about the prophecy, about why the Demon King had come to our realm now, after centuries of dormancy, about why my family's fear had been justified, even if their understanding was flawed. He hadn't come because my curse called to him. He'd come to kill me before I could fulfill my true purpose, before I could become strong enough to send him back to the hell he'd crawled out of. The realization hit me like lightning, and with it came the first stirring of something I'd never felt before: righteous fury. Not at myself, not at the curse I carried, but at the family who'd spent 16 years making me believe I was an abomination. At the village that had demanded my blood without understanding what they were destroying. At the centuries of ignorance that had turned protectors into pariahs. I stopped fighting the chains, stopped trying to suppress my curse. Instead, I let it flow through me like a river of molten silver. Let it paint symbols of power on my skin. Let it sing with the voice of every ancestor who died to give me this gift. The black blood dripping from my wounds began to glow, and the iron chains holding me started to smoke and crack. Impossible, the Demon King snarled, taking a step back. You're just a child, untrained, powerless. I raised my head and looked him in the eye, feeling power I'd never imagined coursing through my veins. You're right, I said, my voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural strength. I am just a child, an untrained, powerless girl whose own family cast her out. The chains shattered like glass. I dropped to my feet, black blood streaming from dozens of wounds, each drop painting symbols of binding and banishment on the earth around me. The power in my veins felt like liquid starlight now, like the concentrated fury of 1,000 fallen heroes demanding justice. But I'm also the last daughter of the binding line, I continued, stepping forward as the crowd pressed back in terror. The final gift of mages who died to protect this realm from creatures like you. The Demon King spread his wings, preparing to take flight, but the symbols my blood had painted began to glow brighter. Bands of silver light rose from the ground, forming a cage of pure magic around him. He was trapped, just as I had been trapped, but his cage was made of power instead of ignorance. This is impossible, he roared, striking at the barriers with claws that could shatter mountains. You don't know how to use your power. You're weak, broken, cursed. That's what they told me, I agreed, gesturing to my cowering family. For 16 years, they convinced me I was a monster, a harbinger of darkness, something to be hidden away and feared. I felt tears on my cheeks, not the black tears that came with suppressed power, but clear ones. Tears of rage and sorrow and terrible understanding. They were so afraid of what I might become that they never bothered to learn what I actually was. They chose fear over knowledge, isolation over understanding. They turned a protector into a prisoner. The silver cage around the Demon King began to shrink, the bands of light drawing tighter. He thrashed against them, but each movement only made them burn brighter. And you, I said, looking up at his burning eyes. You came here to kill me before I could discover my true nature, before I could learn to use the power my ancestors died to give me. His silence was answer enough. But you made one mistake, I continued, raising my hands. Black blood flowed from my wounds in rivers now, painting complex patterns in the air itself. You waited too long. Let me suffer too much. Let their cruelty and ignorance push me to the breaking point. The patterns my blood painted began to resonate, humming with a frequency that made reality itself seem to vibrate. I could feel the veil between worlds responding to my call, feel the barriers that held his realm separate from ours. Because now, I whispered, and my voice carried the weight of 1,000 years of accumulated rage. Now I'm angry enough to send you home the hard way. The Demon King's scream of fury shook the earth, but it couldn't break the bonds of blood and will that held him. For the first time in my life, I stopped being the victim, and I became what I was always meant to be, the thing that monsters feared in the dark. The binding circle blazed with silver fire as I raised my blood-soaked hands toward the trapped Demon King. Every drop that fell from my wounds added another layer to the magical cage, another strand to the web that held him fast. The power coursing through me was intoxicating, not the sick, suppressed energy I'd carried for 16 years, but something clean and bright and absolutely devastating. "You cannot do this," the Demon King snarled, his massive form writhing against the constraints. "I am eternal. I am inevitable. I am trespassing," I finished for him. "This isn't your realm. You forced your way through barriers that have held for 1,000 years, and now you're going to pay the price." I drew more symbols in the air, my blood flowing in impossible patterns that seemed to write themselves. The knowledge flowing through me was overwhelming. Centuries of accumulated wisdom from every binder who'd ever lived, every hero who'd given their life to keep creatures like this at bay. "That's it, child," the ancient voice whispered in my mind. "Feel the power of your lineage. Let it guide you." But even as the magic built around me, even as I felt strong enough to move mountains, part of me couldn't help but look back at the crowd watching in stunned silence. My family stood together, holding each other, their faces pale with shock. Not fear anymore. They were beyond fear now. They looked like people watching something impossible, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world, about me. "Kira," Leanna's voice was small, confused. What are you doing?" I almost laughed at the question. What was I doing? I was saving their lives. I was protecting the realm they'd condemned me for supposedly threatening. I was being exactly what they'd always feared I was, and exactly what they'd never bothered to understand I could be. "I'm ending this," I said, not taking my eyes off the Demon King, "the way I was born to end it." "But the prophecy," the priest began, "was never about me serving demons," I cut him off. "It was about demons fearing me, about the return of a bloodline they thought they'd successfully demonized into extinction." I gestured to the silver cage around the Demon King, watching him strain against bonds that grew stronger with every passing second. "Look at him. Does this look like worship to you? Like willing service?" The truth was written in every line of the demon's furious form, in every desperate attempt to break free. He wasn't here to claim a servant. He was here to eliminate a threat. A threat my own family had spent 16 years trying to eliminate for him. "You were so convinced I was evil," I continued, my voice carrying easily across the clearing, despite speaking in conversational tones, "that you never bothered to ask what I was evil for. You saw dark blood and assumed dark purpose. You felt otherworldly power and decided it must be malevolent." The binding circle pulsed brighter, and I felt the veil between realms responding to my will. It would be so easy to open a gateway, to send the Demon King tumbling back to his own dimension. But that wasn't enough anymore, not after everything I'd endured. "Please," the Demon King said, and for the first time his voice held something other than arrogance. Fear. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you banish me now, you'll return in another century or two with a bigger army," I finished. "You'll find some other way to slip through the cracks, some other method of invasion. That's what demons do, isn't it? They probe for weaknesses, exploit any opening, never stop trying to devour what isn't theirs." I raised my hands higher, feeling the power build to a crescendo that made the air itself seem to sing. "But I'm not going to banish you," I said softly. "I'm going to do what my ancestors should have done the first time you darkened our skies." The silver light surrounding him began to change, shifting from binding magic to something far more permanent, something final. "No," the Demon King breathed. "That power is lost. The Binding Lords died out centuries ago. You cannot possibly—" "I'm the last one," I agreed. "The final daughter of a line everyone forgot was meant to protect them. And you know what that means? I smiled and felt my black blood respond by painting symbols of absolute severance in the air around us. It means there's no one left to tell me this is impossible. The magic erupted from me like a star going supernova, silver light pouring from every drop of blood, every symbol I'd painted, every pattern traced in the air. The binding circle became a vortex of pure force, and at its center, the Demon King began to scream, not in pain, in terror, because he could feel what I was doing to him. Not banishment, not imprisonment, but complete and total annihilation. I was unmaking him, unraveling every thread of dark magic that held his essence together, sending each piece back to the void from which it had originally crawled. It was justice. It was protection. It was the ultimate expression of what the blood of binding had always been meant to do. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever felt. The Demon King's form began to fray at the edges, darkness bleeding away like smoke in a hurricane. He reached toward me with one massive claw, desperation making him attempt one final attack. But the silver light consumed his essence before he could complete the motion. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice already fading. "I am eternal." "You were," I corrected, "but eternity just met its match." The light reached a peak that turned the world white, then collapsed inward with a sound like reality itself taking a deep breath. When it faded, the clearing was empty except for scorched earth and the lingering scent of burning sulfur. The Demon King was gone, not banished, not imprisoned, not merely defeated, destroyed, completely, permanently. I stood in the center of the circle, black blood still flowing from my wounds but no longer forming symbols. The ancient voice in my mind had faded to a whisper of satisfaction, and the overwhelming rush of power was settling into something more manageable, more controlled. For the first time in my life, my curse felt like it truly belonged to me. The silence stretched on for long moments. Then, somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. It was just one person at first, an old farmer named Garrett who'd lost his entire family to demonic raids 20 years ago. Then, another joined him. Then another. Within minutes, the entire gathering was applauding, their fear replaced by wonder and gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like awe. Everyone except my family. They stood apart from the crowd, staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not fear anymore, not disgust, but something more complex. Something that might have been shame. "Kira," my mother said finally, her voice barely audible over the continued applause. We didn't know," I suggested gently. "Didn't understand. Made assumptions based on fear rather than seeking the truth." She flinched as if I'd struck her. "We were trying to protect you," my father said, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded. The prophecies spoke of darkness, of herald of demons. How were we supposed to know? "You could have asked me," I said simply. "In 16 years, you could have asked me once what I felt, what I wanted, what I thought my power might be for. Instead, you decided I was evil and spent my entire life making sure I felt like a monster." Leanna stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Kira, please. We made mistakes, but we're family." "No," I said, and the word carried the weight of 16 years of suppressed hurt. Family doesn't chain their daughter to a tree as a sacrifice. Family doesn't sell their child to a stranger to hide their shame. Family doesn't spend 16 years making someone believe they're fundamentally wrong just for existing. I looked around at all of them, mother, father, sister, the extended relatives and family friends who'd watched me grow up as an unwanted burden. People who'd known me my entire life, but had never once tried to know me. "I saved your lives today," I continued. "I saved this entire realm from a threat that would have consumed everything you hold dear, and I did it using the exact same power you've spent 16 years telling me was evil." The crowd had quieted now, sensing the personal drama playing out in the aftermath of cosmic victory. But they were still watching, still listening, still bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. "So tell me," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear. "If my cursed blood could destroy the Demon King himself, if the darkness you feared in me was actually the light that saved you all, what does that say about your judgment? About your wisdom? About your love?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the realization dawning on faces throughout the crowd, the understanding of what they'd done. what they'd allowed to be done, how close they'd come to losing their only hope because of their own prejudice and fear. I forgive you, I said finally, and meant it. All of you. Because holding on to anger would poison my blood just as surely as your fear poisoned your hearts. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I turned to face the crowd more fully, feeling the weight of their attention, their respect, their newfound understanding of who and what I really was. The blood of binding flows in my veins, I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the clearing. I am the inheritor of an ancient magic, the daughter of heroes who died to protect this realm. The darkness you feared in me was never corruption. It was power. Power meant to stand against the night, to guard the weak, to ensure that monsters know there are still those who will stand in their way. I paused, letting that sink in. But I will not do it from a tower room. I will not serve from the shadows while others take credit for my protection. And I will not hide what I am to make others comfortable. The applause started again, louder this time, but I wasn't finished. If you want the protection of the binding line, I said, then you will acknowledge what that means. You will respect the power that stands between you and the darkness, and you will never again let fear turn protectors into prisoners. Yes, someone shouted from the crowd. Yes, Lady Kira. Lady Kira, not cursed daughter, not abomination, not the thing to be hidden away. Lady. As if I was nobility, as if I was worthy of respect, as if I was exactly what I'd always been, but had never been allowed to become. I looked back at my family one more time, seeing the regret in their eyes, the understanding of what they'd lost through their own willful blindness. I'll be at the manor tonight, I told them. Tomorrow, I'll be gone. There are other threats in this world, other demons testing our defenses, and there is only one person left who can stop them. I smiled, feeling my black blood finally, truly mine. I have work to do. 3 months later, I stood on the battlements of my new fortress, watching the sun set over lands that had once been considered lost to demonic corruption. The tower I'd claimed as my stronghold wasn't like the prison of my youth. This one had been built by the original Binding Lords, its walls inscribed with protective wards that sang in harmony with my blood. It was a home built for someone like me, a sanctuary for power instead of a cage for shame. The letter from my mother sat unopened on my desk, the third one she'd sent in as many weeks. I could sense the contents without breaking the seal, apologies, explanations, desperate attempts to rebuild bridges that had been burned down to the foundation. But I wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe I never would be. The people of this region told a different story about the cursed blood now. They spoke of the Lady Kira Blackthorn who'd appeared like an avenging angel, whose dark magic had purged 3 separate demon incursions and saved countless lives. Children drew pictures of me in their school books, always with silver light streaming from my hands, always standing between innocent people and monsters with too many teeth. I'd become a legend, a hero, everything I'd never been allowed to dream of being. My lady? Marcus, my new steward, appeared at my elbow. He was a young man whose entire family had been saved when I closed a hellgate that had opened near his village. Unlike the servants of my youth, he looked at me with respect instead of fear. The delegation from the capital has arrived. I nodded, not surprised. Word of my activities had spread throughout the kingdom, and the crown was taking notice. They wanted to meet this mysterious lady who commanded the old magics, who could do what entire armies could not. They wanted to offer me titles, lands, gold, recognition and respect, and all the things I'd been denied as a child. But more importantly, they wanted to discuss the other bloodlines. The research I'd been conducting in my spare time, tracking down families who might carry traces of the ancient gifts. Bloodlines that had been scattered and diluted over the centuries. Their children raised in ignorance of their heritage, just as I had been. There were others like me out there. People told they were cursed when they were actually blessed. People made to feel like monsters when they were meant to be protectors. I intended to find them all. Tell them I'll meet with them in an hour, I said to Marcus, and have the kitchen prepare the formal dinner service. If the crown wants to treat with the last Binding Lord, they'll do it properly. Of course, my lady. He paused, then added with quiet satisfaction, They seem quite nervous about meeting you. I smiled at that. Good. Let them be nervous. Let them wonder what I was capable of, what I might demand in exchange for my protection. Let them remember that respect was earned, not freely given. After Marcus left, I walked to my private chambers and opened the wardrobe that held my formal robes. Black silk embroidered with silver thread cut in the ancient style of the Binding Lords. When I wore them, the symbols seemed to shift and move in the fabric, as if my power was woven into every thread. I was no longer the frightened girl who'd hidden her nature to please others. I was no longer the victim who'd accepted abuse as her due. I was no longer the prisoner in her own family's tower. I was Lady Kira Blackthorn, last daughter of the Binding Line, slayer of demons, protector of the realm, and I was exactly as powerful and terrifying and magnificent as they'd always feared I would be. As I dressed for dinner with the Crown's representatives, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were different now, still human, but with flecks of silver that hadn't been there before. The power I'd awakened had changed me, marked me as something beyond ordinary mortality. But for the first time in my life, I liked what I saw looking back. Later that night, after the delegation had left with their carefully worded agreements and their promises of support, I received an unexpected visitor. The ancient mage Morgwyn stood in my doorway, looking exactly as she had when I was 3 years old. "Hello, child," she said, her voice still heavy with secrets. "It's time we had a proper conversation." I gestured her inside, curious despite myself. "About what?" "About why I lied to your parents all those years ago." She settled into a chair by my fireplace, her ancient eyes reflecting the flames. "About what I really saw when I examined your blood." My heart skipped a beat. "You knew what I was?" "I knew exactly what you were, and I knew what would happen if I told them the truth." Morgwyn smiled sadly. "Your parents weren't ready to hear that their daughter was born to be the most powerful magic user in 1,000 years, that she would one day command forces that could reshape reality itself. So you lied. I gave them a version of the truth they could accept. The blood of binding, properly understood, isn't a curse at all, but neither is it safe or comfortable or easily controlled. Your parents needed to fear your power enough to contain it until you were old enough to understand what it meant." I stared at her, feeling pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed finally clicking into place. "You wanted them to suppress my abilities." "I wanted your power to mature slowly, safely, without consuming you before you learned wisdom." Her expression grew grave. "The original Binding Lords were incredibly powerful, but many of them died young. They burned through their own life force trying to wield magic they weren't ready for. And the isolation? The abuse?" Morgwyn's face fell. "That was never meant to happen. I told your parents to be cautious, to help you learn control. I never intended for them to treat you as a prisoner, as a monster." The anger that rose in me was cold and controlled now, refined by months of learning to channel my power constructively. "You could have intervened. You could have corrected their course. By the time I realized what they'd done, the damage was already irreversible. You'd learned to suppress your abilities so thoroughly that I feared forcing the issue would drive you mad." She leaned forward, her ancient eyes intense. "But when the Demon King came, when you were pushed to the breaking point, you found your own way to the truth. And you did it with a wisdom and control that your ancestors never achieved." I considered her words, weighing them against my own experience. There was logic in what she said, even if the cost had been devastating. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you do what you were born to do," Morgwyn replied. "You find the others. You rebuild the binding orders. You prepare for the greater darkness that's coming." "Greater darkness?" Her smile was grim. "Did you think one Demon King was the extent of the threat?" "Child, what you faced was merely a scout. The real invasion is still years away, but it's coming. And when it arrives, this realm will need every protector it can get." The weight of that revelation settled over me like a mantle. Not just one enemy defeated, but an entire war still to fight. Not just my own power to master, but others to train and guide. It should have been overwhelming, terrifying, impossible. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Then I'd better get to work," I said. Morgwyn nodded approvingly. "Indeed you had. The first bloodline traces I've found are in the northern provinces. a family named Ravencrest with a daughter who speaks to shadows. They believe she's possessed by demons. Of course they do. I was already reaching for my traveling cloak. How soon can we leave? Eager, aren't you? The ancient mage chuckled. Very well, we leave at dawn. But Kira? She caught my arm as I moved toward the door. Remember that not everyone will be ready to accept the truth as quickly as you did. Some will fight their nature until the very end. Then I'll fight for them until they're strong enough to fight for themselves, I replied. The way someone should have fought for me. As I prepared for the journey ahead, I caught sight of my family's letters again. 3 unopened pleas for forgiveness, for understanding, for a chance to make amends. Maybe someday I'd be ready to hear what they had to say. Maybe someday the wounds they'd inflicted would heal enough to allow room for reconciliation. But not today. Today I had other lost children to find, other cursed bloodlines to awaken, other protectors to forge from the raw material of pain and suppressed power. I was no longer the victim of my family's fear and ignorance. I was the weapon their neglect had forged, tempered in suffering and sharpened by injustice into something that could cut through any darkness. And I had a realm to save. The cursed blood they'd cast me out for had become exactly what it was always meant to be, the thing that stood between the innocent and the monsters that hunted them. Justice, it turned out, tasted like silver fire and felt like coming home.